Hi everyone, welcome to DocuSpace episode 3. Welcome back to your grandmother's living room. I am Ravi, I will be your host.
And I'm Joseph. I'll be your other host. So today's episode is option D, all of the above. And we're going to be talking about all the things that are intrinsically linked to architecture, our interests and such. So I'll give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourselves. We can start with Kara.
Oh no, Kara was not ready. Hi, my name is Karina. I go by Kara. Wait, okay. Do we do the same introduction as last time, or
Whatever
Whatever you
you
want to
want
say.
to.
whatever you want?
Yeah.
I'm an architect working in New York for a traditional architecture firm. And on the side, I work with a few of my friends in a mural collective to design public art, and as well as do architectural research with other friends.
And then Jack.
Hello, I'm Jack, an architect living in London. I do my own art and architecture projects, as well as being a practicing architect in a medium-sized firm in London.
Hi, I'm Veronica. I'm also an architect, I guess, sort of, living in London, but I'm currently working like completely remotely and kind of trying to decenter design in my life and focusing on my research practice.
Yeah, I think it's we have a really good variety of cast of people here today. Yeah, and your intros were very telling because you went to add things that you do outside of architecture and your other interests. And that's what this episode will really be about, is about helping people to realize or to also get a little insight into what architects do and what we think about. And so today we'll be talking about most of those other things that we typically treat as secondary, but I think to us they are just as important as our actual design practices and how we look at the world. Yeah, so what's some of your
Agreed.
thoughts, Yusuf?
I think we should talk about our interests too, Joseph. You keep forgetting us every single time.
Or just the background. Yeah. I guess for me personally, before architecture even became a thing for me, I was always super interested in history, art to a to a more casual degree. I like art, but I don't really do it super seriously. And then very much into like sociology. I really like people, and I think people are super interesting, and they make life go how it goes. Yeah, and I think all those things naturally flow into architecture pretty well. But sometimes depending on what we're doing or what the problem requires, there's constraints that make that a bit hard. I'm not sure if you guys have had similar experiences with that.
hmm Well, I'm Rabi. You know that. I am also an architect practicing at a traditional firm in New York. On the side, I do architecture research with friends. We're basically talking about each other. Kara and I
We are the friends.
are the friends. Um, and you're gonna get tired of hearing this, but I'm really interested in film, but also its intersection with history, the silent film era, and then how that generally just changed the world a little bit with the introduction of a new medium and how we connect to it now, so on such a deeper level. And I do feel that, and Joseph and I talked about this while we were practicing for the episode, but how like the vocabulary we begin to use as different designers is kind of related to our interests in some way, that somehow, like, I know that Joseph uses urban a lot in his design vocabulary, and then I would use like the word like cinematic or dramatic a lot, and that's really interesting. I also used to paint. I don't paint anymore, and I do read a lot of fictional things, and I feel that that do kind of bring some kind of like whimsy into stuff that I personally work on.
You,
So
you
these
know, on
things.
the conversation about painting and art, I'm not sure about you guys, but have you guys ever heard that debate of like, is architecture art or science or STEM
Or humanities.
or humanities? Yeah, like I guess like we're on the spectrum. Do you guys fall on that? Personally, I think more humanities. Before I used to think art, but I guess after school I've changed my mind on that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I
between arts
definitely.
and humanities.
Yeah, definitely on the art humanities side.
Yeah, same. Very much in the humanities. I also have just finished my master's degree a while ago, but which is actually like entirely situated within the field of like visual culture. So like it's moving away from um design as science, very much the humanities.
And it's interesting that the first topic that was specifically mentioned is maybe Rabi's film, and that this is the chosen media that you two have been developing for this forum.
Yeah. Usually podcasts are voice-based, and we as architects are very, I guess the right term is wadcast, WOD. But like we as designers are just very visual people. So I was like, I don't know how to do this without putting our faces into it. And then Vero, I don't think you've seen our graphic, but I'll send it to you later. It's just like a living room and we have frames on the wall, and this is very meta because the audience is going to be seeing
Looking
me
at the
talking
living
in
room
a
you're already
frame
on.
where I'm explaining the frame. But we couldn't do it without it, and that also is really interesting because um our thoughts as like architects were kind of bleeding into how we're literally designing a podcast. And I don't think the word design is used often for podcasts, but it was really interesting some things we thought about, or how to put together certain topics, or how you develop narratives. Also an interesting thing that's common between film and then architecture, like you need, or stories architecture or literature and architecture, is that narrative becomes so important. And yeah, and like just broader terms, I feel what I wanted to talk about personally in this episode was just that most fields just bleed into one another. Like it's not solitary in any way, and that we're collaborating on very small and very larger levels, different in school, different in work. And yeah.
Yeah, especially like in school. I know some school curriculums and pedagogies are different, but you know, you would do things very much on your own, and maybe like you'd have a professor that's like the outside voice to help guide you a little bit. And in work, it's that, at least in my experience, that almost never happens. um, and I think that's the benefit of things. Like we have projects where, depending on the prompt, will, you know, feel that it's strong for our candidacy for the project to bring like a historian on, or a journalist, or an artist, or a dancer. And those people become as integral to the building design as the people that are literally going to design it. And I think those are like very intrinsically important to architecture, even though you won't see this because the building will doesn't tell you this. But yeah, I think those are things that are maybe less spoken about in architecture, is how reliant and how dependent we are in having these other voices that have these other experiences be part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think just kind of to add on to Robbie's point earlier, that I think because there's this like thing that people call the spatial turn in the humanities, I think it also makes it difficult for us who maybe have a background in design but have interest in all of these other fields to like situate ourselves within a very specific practice. So I think by nature, we kind of exist in this like transdisciplinary space that is exciting, but it comes with its own challenges.
Too many challenges.
Yeah.
It's like I don't know how to be both. I know I can't realistically be both things. Like I want to be a production designer at some point, and if I don't like it, of course I'll come back and be an architect. But it's like I know I can be both, but I don't know how to be both. But these things, but like elements of one kind of get into the other, like lighting design, sound design, you know, or like set design and designing interiors and all that. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of challenges with doing our interests, implementing them into our other interests, but it is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like geography as a subject and another humanity was like I remember at school being like one of my main interests. And then that being quite a diverse topic as it is, it just sort of very naturally sort of weaves it into interests in like culture and landscape and politics that all have quite a large bearing on design, and particularly operating as an architect, which is massively constrained and influenced by culture and politics. So that for me was like quite a big, yeah, a theme that sort of followed through from that interest into what I do on a day to day. But yeah, I find it interesting, like which the people we choose to collaborate, with, what when they sort of, it's obviously most valuable when they offer something that we don't necessarily offer. So, like for example, working with a community engagement group while on my work projects, like I find in my work projects that our role is so fixated on the design, the physicality, the fabric, that I can't give my full attention, and that like you can't spare the time to do that job properly. So it becomes, for the way we work, like a very important collaborator. But then conversely, there's maybe some things that actually the architect maybe wants to hold on to in a role. And I think there's been a narrative in the last, I don't know, decade that maybe the architect has let too many of their responsibilities slip to other consultants, which I do feel as well. And I think a big one in the UK at the moment is building regulations. And the feeling is that architects have let that part of designing buildings slip too far from the architect's scope. And then something like Grenfell happened because there was no one taking responsibility for that role, because there's a bit of a grey area that, we were collaborating with an approved inspector, and we were collaborating with the manufacturer, and we were collaborating with, and actually there's the latest kind of legislation change in the Building Safety Act in the UK is that there's more onus and more liability and responsibility on the architect, so that the responsibility for those items can't slip into a nowhere field of being between two people's roles, which I think is interesting. So like pulling it back to like collaboration and having different interests, it really feels like it's quite a difficult balance of sometimes of when it's a time to make it your own interest, or when it's time to actually hand a specialism over to someone really like particular, with specialist knowledge.
That's a really good way to put it, because like you're saying, like we can't do everything. We shouldn't do everything, because you can, sure you can, but you probably won't do it as well as the person who's specialized in that.
Yeah, for sure.
And we definitely can, debate about like where the boundaries of the architect ends and everything else starts. I know my boss likes to say that he's like he's the conductor of the orchestra as an architect, and his job is to just like make sure that all these things flow to make the symphony, which becomes the building. And I think that's really one really cool way to look at it. Is that in a weird way, like our interest allows us to at least realize the importance of these other things to us, and to make space for them. And even outside of, getting technical about making a building, it also just makes it enjoyable. Personally, I know, like when I was first studying architecture school, I was thinking, oh wow, I need to know physics and math, all these things. And like I think I've used like an intense level of math, not even an intense level. Like I was just figuring out like a formula for how to calculate the sides of a building, and I was like, wow, I have done it. I've used math, but outside of that, it's not been so intense.
Well, math is beautiful. Carrie, you were saying something. You should just go.
No, Vera was saying something.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go. I'll continue after.
No, I was just gonna recall this anecdote. My chemistry teacher in high school used to say, like, you would assume that he's like a chemistry teacher and he loved chemistry, so he would advocate for that subject, but he would just say, like, math is the mother of all sciences. And I know this is going too broad in the confines of what we're talking about, but it kind of bleeds into everything, and that just makes it really beautiful. Like we like to say that, oh, when are we gonna use, sine, cosine, and tan? But we do. Like just the other day I was working on a Revit model and I had to put the literal equation in there, and I was like, oh, I am using it in real life. Okay. Yeah. So it's just subjects I've learned so far back also kind of like bleed into design now in school and everything. And that's really cool about it. Yeah.
I thought software had taken away the need to use
Yeah, I was about to
maths,
say that.
and then I had to
Software is
learn
slowly
Grasshopper and
encroaching.
Revit, as you said, like, and
Yeah.
actually I was like, oh wait, these things save me time again. I'll take that.
You might still be the first person to ever say I've used Crossline in real life that I've heard
I was like, what am I
personally.
doing at work? I'm not doing any of that.
Like, I'm doing InDesign presentations right now, so no Crossline's there. But I think it's really interesting. I don't know how it was about for you guys, but when I was in high school and I was kind of like decently good at everything, a lot of what my teachers actually pointed me to architecture as an interdisciplinary subject. So it's like even people outside of the field kind of acknowledge it as like a mix of science, a mix of math, a mix of art. And to see that that kind of stays true even later and maybe becomes even more complex. It's really interesting.
I think that's like in some ways one of the most attractive but also dangerous characteristic of architects, this I can do anything attitude.
Yes.
And I mean, I think it's the thing that also makes us good designers is that like the way we go through life is that like our attitude to things often is that I can do this as well. But that also means that we are going to stay at like a surface level understanding of like many different things, but will actually lack the time, not really the ability, but the time and the capacity to go deep in topics that sometimes actually we might need to. Like Jack, you brought up Grenfell, and I think there are like it's one of many examples where actually architecture could benefit from like a deepening of and kind of a construction of very knowledge and
Could you
understanding.
maybe explain what happened there? Because I'm not sure.
I don't know of what
I'm
you're talking.
familiar.
Yeah, I'm just nodding. Like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna research this later.
And then like also if
So,
like anyone's listening, you know, they might not
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, that's
I
a
mean,
quick synopsis if possible.
it's a
Yeah.
big topic, and I don't pretend to be a professional on it. But Grenfell Tower tragedy was in 2019, and 70 people lost lost their lives in a fire in a residential building.
Okay.
Since then, there's been the Hackett report, which was really attempting to find out what went wrong, and that's led to a number of regulatory reforms in the UK. Most recently, the Building Safety Act, which is moving to put more liability on design professionals.
Also, I don't want to butcher this, but as like kind of like a side note onto that is that like the tragedy was caused because of like a cheap facade material that was put on this tower as a form of like retrofitting because I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like a higher value neighborhood and building was being pulled up nearby it, and then they wanted to make this tower fit into like to make it like aesthetically cleaner or whatnot, and in that process they had kind of like sidestepped certain regulations that made it into this like really dangerous object, a death trap, really. But
And
it,
yeah, to
Yeah, I
this day,
remember
there hasn't really been any.
fire.
There hasn't been any prosecutions to any individual because the fault lies with so many different parties that it's like a nightmare of liability. But something like
That's crazy.
intrinsically wrong with the UK kind of construction industry, really. Yeah.
I think what's really interesting about what Vera said about that I can do everything. Like part of it is that we are interested in it and we want to learn as many things as we can. But I think a huge part of it is also the architect's ego of kind of like not wanting to let go of your design. And so you can just do everything that you know it's yours. Yeah.
Yeah, I still struggle with that. Like wanting to do everything, yes, but it's just, you know, they all teach you in school to kind of separate yourself from your work and try to not attach unhealthy feelings to it. And like, of course, we all attach unhealthy feelings to it. And it's interesting how, like, for me personally, I don't know if for you guys, but like it started, this has started to bleed into my work projects, where like if I'm working on something and then someone else also has to work on something, I feel kind of like really possessive about what I'm working on, and I shouldn't, but I do.
Counseling, Robbie.
Wait until you have to start delegating, and then it's like, it's that I'm giving up something feeling. Yeah, that's the fate that we are bound to come to. No, I
It's
like
funny when I'm thinking about all the other things in my life that architecture affects. The inverse is not as I guess the inverse is not as tangible sometimes, right? Like we hear stories about like, oh, some of the biggest fashion designers have architecture backgrounds, or people who are in video game design need architecture backgrounds, or like Ferris wheels and like these amusement thingies. But like at least in working, I do feel that even though we do engage with the research of, or we're going to research art, we're going to research history, we're going to research politics. Um, Unfortunately, at least for me, I feel like it's very hard to actually have those things translate in a way that is meaningful to the amount of research was done. I don't know if you guys feel that, but sometimes I'm like, for how interesting the research was, it looks very typical, and that's something that I've always struggled with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the huge difference between my like 9 to 5, where I feel very much like I work within the scope of what I expect an architect to work with, and then anything I do with, like, I guess my friends or collaborators outside of work, where it becomes so much more multidisciplinary, and it's also so much easier to see people and their different inputs. And I don't know if it's like a scale of the project or the fact that the firm is kind of like more liable for things and they have to follow like stricter regulations. But that's a huge difference of like my 9 to 5 is, I'm an architect, I work in CAD, I make floor plans, and then after my 9 to 5 I do sociology research, or I paint, or community workshop works, all based within and around architecture. But yeah,
More free.
yeah, we're great. Yeah. No floor plans.
No, it's interesting. I had like a really tough work week just now. And I was working till like honestly 12 p.m. once this week. And I was much more happier doing it than I would have been doing it in school, because I was like, hey, at least I'm getting paid.
Are you?
Well, no.
Not
No,
for the over hour.
Yeah, so just
you just ruined it for me, Jack.
Sorry, reality.
In
I'll do
food
that.
and Uber rides, yes. Okay. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
funny too, because sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, you go.
I'll be quick about it, but I was about to say, like, it's funny how we have to do these cartwheels for ourselves to make up for the missed value in what we do. But yeah.
I was just gonna say it's funny because I think I was in very much the same place where you are at, like, what was that, like 2 years ago? Yeah, working weekends, and I mean every hour that I worked overtime was paid. But then now I'm like kind of in this weird place in my life where I'm only an architect part-time, so it's like it really doesn't feel like it's the center of my life, and I'm actually really enjoying it because I was missing design while I was studying, but now I can use architecture to like earn a living and pay my rent, but then I also have a lot of free time that I can invest in like other projects that I can't really capitalize on at the moment. But I think I actually have found like the perfect balance, and I think a lot of architects would be much happier in this situation if, you know, the culture around work was a little bit different, if it didn't require like 200% of your time and energy.
Yeah, the dream is to work part-time as an architect and then part-time as whatever else.
Yeah.
That will be changing monthly.
The dream. Yeah.
It just comes with a bit of precarity. You know, you never know.
You can't have it all.
You have to risk something. Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering what are your experiences with like multidisciplinary within the practice you work with, because I think the practices that I've worked with haven't been particularly diverse in terms of they've usually been about the same size, but in some experiences there's been a multidisciplinary team, or in another instance there was like it was just all architects, but actually in the one, and to an extent you think like, oh, I've learned so much from a mixed team. But there's also, on the other hand, like when I was working as just in a team of just architects, the architects were doing kind of everything, kind of all work stages, all the technical design, the concept design, the landscape design. I don't know, what are your experiences with practices that maybe have engineers or like a, you know, a more diverse skill set?
Interesting. Well, personally, I work in a very, very small firm, but I do when I first heard of firms that do this, I always imagined it'd be a lot more fluid and like intertwined. But from what I've heard, it tends to be very much more siloed. So it's like I do my thing, I send it to you, you do your thing, you send it back to me. But we have worked with other firms, so you know, on one of our projects, we have a landscape architect that is like very much hand in hand with what we do. Um, and there is a huge push to try to give that agency to the landscape architect as well. Because sometimes it feels like we decide and then they do it. And sometimes there's very little room for conversation for them to bring their inputs into it. And I think it goes back to like the ownership thing that we were talking about, is sometimes it's really good to know when it's time to step back and give people the space to maybe change how you're seeing things, right? I think it's something that architects try to do. We're always trying to change how people are looking at things, but sometimes we also need to realize that our expertise can really benefit when we allow for these other sectors to shine, I guess.
I think and I haven't been working very long, and like it's a traditional architecture firm, so you know it's like very traditional collaborations with like engineers or landscape architects. But I think the coolest one I heard the other day was art consultant, like, and I was like, oh, that's really cool. And the person was just like, the conversation that was happening was around like, oh, should we suggest art pieces for the design as well? And then the senior person said that no, we don't know enough about it. I think we would need an art consultant. And I think that's a good example of just architects admitting that, oh, we can't do everything always, and there's so much we can learn from others. And yeah.
Yeah, but even working with consultants is like, it really depends on every single consultant what your role then is. Because I was on a project with landscape architects, and I don't think our client kind of chose the collaborators more so than we did, and I think we're very at odds with one another. So I remember being frustrated getting like CAD plans from them and then having to clean them up, or like the person I'm working under would redline them and I would be sending them back to the landscape architect. And it'll be just like back and forth. Her be like, this is not my role. Like, this is not who I was training to be. I know nothing about this. I don't know why we're putting like these type of plants here. Like, I don't know anything about that. And it was like, why are we working with another team? And then we're asking them for all of this advice, but then we override it the moment it comes to us. So that was also weird. Like, yeah, not fully being able to let go of that control.
That's very similar to my experience at my last company. We were like notoriously bad at like working together with other yeah, like for example, like interior designers, like with, well, not me personally, but like with like the relationship with interior designers have gotten so toxic that they had to leave the project, or same with landscape architects. I think maybe like there was a bit more respect shown towards like structural engineers, because like it wasn't always like a feeling that we could do their jobs better. So that was an interesting parallel, but yeah, very similar. How about you, Jack?
Well, I think I've been in both situations, kind of yours, Carolina's, and Joseph's. But I think probably at the moment I'm in a team with interior designers and landscape architects in-house. So we do. I have seen like us kind of reacting almost in a critical way to other consultants, and yeah, I guess it does result in a little bit of stepping on each other's toes, and it also, I think, where there's like a scope overlap, and to an extent we're leaders, architects often lead designers, so it's kind of our role to coordinate the team, and that's actually kind of like our responsibility that these relationships do work in a lot of cases. So I think that's something that I and a lot of like designers who start this career for a love of design need to learn, like pretty sharpish, that you've actually also got to be a project manager. And
surprisingly, my favorite collaboration has been with politicians in a project.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is
That is surprising. Not see that coming.
It was honestly the novelty of it that was like so cool to me, was having to learn how they look at things in the built environment. And of course with politics, like they don't do any design, but like things like naming the project, or even like putting funds towards it, and what order things are done in. Those were like really interesting to me, right? Because I was having to learn it from like a managerial side of things, but like at the scale of a city, and also at the scale of like trying to protect your own interests, and your backers and all those types of things. I'm not sure much I'm allowed to say about this project, but very vaguely, there was very interesting situation where I remember I was thinking like obviously this should be how it's done, right? Like, this is the history of this site, and we have learned about it. And so in today's modern day and age and sensitivities, we should address it in some way, shape, or form, whether we're changing it or whether we're contextualizing it. We should do something about it, right? And it was so interesting because the mayor who we got to talk to was like, we can't do that, because if we do that, we are going to be saying this X, Y, and Z things, which will then create these problems for me to even manage to do this project, right? And he had to think about it in a way of like not necessarily just pursuing his interests as a politician, but doing it in a way that allows him to still keep everybody happy enough with him to actually do what he wants to do, right? Because the minute you start to have divisiveness, it becomes impossible. And that was like something that was like really humbling to me, because I was like, okay, well, I assumed that I knew better about like how things should be done, but sometimes, even though they're not done in the way I would like them to be, or like I would think they should be done, there is very important reasons that are tied to these other fields. And it's only when you get to talk to someone there and they get to explain it to you, then you're like, oh wow, like carry on, makes sense. Yeah, so I think that's like one of those examples of like why it's so important to have conversation with these people. And I know that in some firms, like there is that effort to invite people in. I just, I guess like given that how small our firm is, I just hope like in those instances there's enough room for those conversations to happen. But naturally we're all human, and sometimes it doesn't go as well. But that's one that I personally really cherish, because it really like I think helped me grow as a designer.
That's very cool, actually. And also, it's just sometimes we just don't know all the repercussions or the problems. Like every person thinks differently, and every person from different professions think differently. And like you said, the politician thought of problems that an architect couldn't think of, like issues that possibly can arise. And that's why certain collaborations become important. So another question that I wanted to kind of ask you guys was like, what collaborations do you think are important, or like who are people you want to collaborate with, or like people of different disciplines that you would like to collaborate with on something, or your firm is collaborating on something, stuff like that. Yeah. Do we have? We don't.
I mean, immediately is like it's very project specific. I would say like having a list of collaborators. So, not necessarily at work. I'm not in the project manager place yet, so I don't necessarily like staff the teams or anything. But when I do personal projects, it's like you kind of identify the scope and you identify what are maybe areas of overlap. And then I'm actually like doing a project right now with friends where we're at that stage. We're like looking at like what are the stakeholders in this, and like who are our collaborators, like what are the fields that we're exploring, and which friends or like friends of friends, what is our network that we can start pulling in. And most immediately right now we're going to be looking at an indigenous like studies expert, videographer, and like data scientist. So those are all like three very different things, but there would be supplementing our basic skills.
That's super interesting.
We'll see where it goes.
You're gonna learn so much. Oh my gosh, this is good.
As Carolina said, I feel it's again very project specific, but it kind of ties into what Jonathan was saying about the structural engineer, or someone, no, Joseph was saying about the structural engineer, maybe. Being like not having as much scope overlap with the architect. But I guess I'm working at quite a detailed stage on a building, big old building. And honestly, one of the most valuable relationships is the facade engineer, who actually at face value think actually quite a big potential for overlap with the architects and disagreements. But actually, I think because there's an element of they're doing the testing, some carbon analysis, some more less about the aesthetics, more about the functionality of the thing, that actually it feels like the relationship works really well. So I'm really valuing that relationship at the moment.
Yeah, I am having a hard time answering this question, I think, because it's not so applicable to my commercial design at the moment. But I've actually been like in my own practice, I've been collaborating with people only outside of architecture. So I kind of see my design background as this thing that I bring with myself onto other projects. So it's and I've been really enjoying working together with people who have like radically different backgrounds, but then we work on the same project and working towards the same output. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. That's like maybe just wanted to explain why I'm a bit silent, because yeah, I don't know how to frame it for my commercial practice.
You framed it perfectly. It's, these different pieces coming together and just creating magic. And that's what this episode is about. And with that, we just are going to ask you our concluding question. You don't have to answer, or you can, but essentially, like, what do you want the audience to take away from this conversation? And I'm just gonna begin by answering it, so you all have time to answer it. It's just, I constantly bring this up, and I brought this up in previous conversations as well, that like we're architects, so we're so much more. And we do try to do everything, but one thing I do want to take away, the audience takeaway, is also that it's okay to give up a little bit of your control just so that you can learn something new, and that's going to probably enrich your experience. And also that if just embrace kind of like the multidisciplinary nature of things. Things don't have rigid boundaries, and when you allow yourself to kind of expand out, it can be great. Yeah.
And Max. Oh, go ahead, Jack.
Oh, I was just going to say, conversely, there's a time to trust your instincts, and if you're passionate about something, don't let that slip away. Let it become part of your identity as a designer. You know, I'm sure every other industries would be like, that's your niche. You're an architect, but you really care about water architect. That sounds like a business opportunity.
Maybe we need to
rising sea levels.
Yeah,
Sorry,
exactly,
Vero.
and like solve a problem. And people nowadays have such a diverse span of interests that that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, maybe we need to like stop constricting ourselves to the papers that we hold and maybe not introduce ourselves as an architect, but because that brings it with itself like a whole set of limitations that could hinder the successful completion of the project. So.
I think that's really cool. Like the definition of the architect becomes much more personal, based on like your experiences and what I guess drives your architectural knowledge. And to go back to that project I was mentioning earlier, like I think that's definitely like been like a core memory of mine now. I was telling my boss, like, I was like, I did nothing related to architecture today. All I did was go to meetings, listen to politicians talk, go to another meeting. This guy had his thing to say. And the whole thing was just so fascinating. Like it was very mind blowing. And actually on my Instagram, I changed my bio. I like, okay, I want to be a public servant now. I think that's like now the thing that drives me is I want to do because the passion of these people when they're talking about how they want to serve, you know, the people they were presenting, and every decision they were making was around that. Maybe I met like really good politicians today, but that was like it really changed me. I was like, okay, that's the type of architect I want to do. I want to be the architect that like every decision I make will be driving around how I think I can benefit people. Um, yeah, and I think like what Jack was saying, right? Like that definition, maybe what architect becomes thing, but for me, I think public servant. I think architects can be public servants. Maybe that's not the dictionary definition, but for me, that's what it means to me. And I guess in that vein, what I would like for people to take away is to maybe have a bit more kind of like um, openness towards looking at things. I think in other fields, these things happen pretty naturally. I have a friend who's actually studying theater. He has a comp sci background, and his thesis was on like making these VR avatars that have like realistic lip movements for theater performances. I thought that was super cool. And I kind of wish that in some ways in architecture we could do that more explicitly sometimes. I know some firms do this in varying degrees, so I'm not saying nobody does this, but that is something that I think will be really cool for the practice and for people on the user end of things, maybe to find spaces and ways to educate us. I know that maybe, you know, not everybody gets to talk to an architect, but that's something that I think would be really good is to have that interface of, you know, user experiences and like what people care about, right? Like if you're a dancer that will be using this performance hall, maybe there needs to be space for you to share that experience with us or, you know, things like that.
Okay.
I feel like we just a little ball camera.
So, yeah, no, because my takeaways are just so not following what you just said. So I was like, do I just cut it? But yeah. Well, for me, I think it's also like for me personally a message, but I think we're like in our 20s, and maybe this is also relevant later on. I don't know, but like you don't have to stick to what like a decision you once made. So we study architecture, we are working as architects, but maybe there are things that are pulling us, and maybe it's worth exploring. And you know, you can always quit a job, get a new one, and then maybe go back, right? So, well, yeah, maybe not in this economy. Give yourself like a year of job ups, but so I don't know. It's just because things tie into architecture can tie into other things. We also don't always have to like stick to something, and if there are other interests, they're also worth exploring, and taking that risk sometimes pays off. So
agreed. Take risks, people.
Non-architecture, feel free to come in, and if you're an architect and you want to leave, take that and go somewhere else.
Yeah. I like take a break. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was wonderful. You guys are so good at articulating yourself. I just wanted to say that because yeah. Okay, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you to our guests for being here. Please like and subscribe. Do we say that, Joseph? We don't say that. Okay, yeah, please bring your
We do
friends
say
to
that.
this
Yeah.
living room for our next episode. And just keep hydrated, everyone. Take care. Bye
Drink your
bye.
Moody next time.
Bye
Bye. Thanks for coming, guys.
bye. Thanks for
Bye.
having us.